You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Saw the games.
Physical basketball
I was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
not.
fouling.
You watched them on YouTube. I saw the games. I watched the games.
Well, we're here. Welcome to X's and Joe's. I'm Bob Moats, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Weemuth. Welcome you to episode 20, NIL, How Financial Opportunities for Athletes is Transforming the Competitive Landscape in College Basketball. Recorded on the morning of Sunday, November 3rd, 2024. So, Bob, remember about, this was like 3 months ago, I suggested we should start brainstorming around finding some more guests, to haul on to the show. And I had one particular name at the top of the group of our list. And not but 3 weeks later, that very person reached out to us just to discuss collaborating on one of his own podcasts related to world history. And that person is none other than our guest today, Robie Malcomson. Robbie, welcome to X's and Joe's.
Thank you, gentlemen. A long-time listener of 19 episodes and first-time caller.
Yeah, I was saying, Robbie, in how we were able to meet up, I said, if only dating were that easy. You think about calling the girl, and then out of nowhere, she calls you to ask you out to the coffee house. I mean, why can't the rest of life be that undemanding?
Yeah, because I have no idea what it's like having the girl calling me back. I mean, that was I don't know what was that like. Anybody know what that was? What that feeling was?
You're still waiting on it. You're still
waiting on it. Yeah, my wife. Yeah. My wife does it. Yeah, she's just like, yeah, I was there. I signed the paper. Seemed like a good idea.
As just a little bit of background, our guest today, Robie Malcomson. Robbie was the co-host of the IU Sports podcast Hoosier Heartland, which also featured Bill Murphy, Kathy Chong, and his twin brother Ben. And just as a note, we'll possibly be bringing some of Robbie's former co-hosts onto our pod at some point down the road. So we're still exploring that. But Robbie, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, no problem. To go back to what you said earlier, you implied that it's almost like a divine intervention thing, like maybe the universe has aligned on one of those things. But so first off, I've been a history teacher for 16 years. And I currently teach world history in an advanced European history class. I have recently started a history podcast called Trapped in History. And I wanted to get back into podcasting again because even though we haven't met each other previously, I do feel connected to you all because I've been connected along that Indiana podcasting tree in one way or another. So I got into podcasting because of my twin brother, Ben Malcomson. But it was actually Jared Frederick, if I recall correctly, that taught Ben how to do the podcasting, like all the audio, the mixing and things. And then as he was getting Hoosier Heartland started, he had met Coach Tonsoni. And then I think he mentored Coach Tonsoni on how to do it. And then later, as we know, Coach Tonsoni joined Assembly Call. And then I branched off of that. And then I started doing a philosophy podcast and now a history one. So I've been able to meet a great deal of people within the Indiana community. And I just think it couldn't be a better community to get involved with. So as far as like being involved in this, I've done podcasting for a while now. I guess it's been about 5 years total. And but I enjoy it, and I love teaching. And I'm just glad to now transcend that over to podcasting and then be able to join you all today.
Great.
Well, we're glad you're on board. You're on the show today, and we look forward to talking to you a little bit more about NIL. But I just want to say, as we've been interacting over the last, what'd you say, like 3 weeks, Mike? Has it been about that period of time?
That, yeah.
Really have enjoyed kind of watching, and I would say giving Robbie's history podcast a listen to. The way that he presents history to his kids is exactly how all history teachers, I think, want to do it at the end of the day, because there is this conversational piece to it where, and I think we try to bring this to our conversations also, where it's like there's no definitive answer, but a lot of times it's how you justify the answer, or how you justify the answer that you're trying to propose, because there could be multiple ways to get to a conclusion. There's never one path. Well, if you just do this, like if the Imperial Japanese Navy had just attacked here next, it would have just fallen. There's no, there's so much so many variables that kind of float in, as well as, in any sort of policy conversation, which ultimately with basketball, when we talk about it, it does come down to kind of a policy conversation of, if you tweak this and don't tweak that, what happens? There's other variables that kind of factor into that, and some, so we really appreciated getting to know Robbie over the last few weeks, and just going through these conversations that, sharpen the saw, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I know that I kind of encourage the whole inquiry-based form of learning. And you could do those sort of scenarios, like you said, like the what if scenarios of like what this would have happened. But it's really just about trying to get students to think critically and be more into dialogue and discussion. Because as you know, even though we're all highly connected today through social media, I think most of the studies show that we're more isolated in some cases now than we ever have been from each other socially. So thank you for what you had said there. It's definitely, one of the main reasons why I try to teach that way.
So.
Yeah, that's great. So, Robbie, did you watch the football game yesterday?
I did, but I caught it. I told you guys beforehand, I'm probably gonna lose my man card here, but I was coming back from a baby shower. I was trying to get the husband points and going to the baby shower. We got back, and I got back at halftime. But I actually had a friend text me because I didn't see the first quarter. Apparently, that was good that I had missed the first quarter. So a friend texted me, and he said that, well, I guess the streak had to end somewhere. So I took it as we must just be getting killed. So I went on the Gamecast on my phone, and of course I do that thing that we all do where I just constantly refresh X over and over again to get. So I think I saw Galen or someone post that we were down 10-0. And I remember texting back. I was like, dude, it's only 10 points. It's the first quarter. I said, but I will say, as Indiana fans, we're kind of conditioned to panic. We're used to that. And it was the first time we've trailed all season. But then by the end of the second quarter, the next time I checked, we were up, I think, 21-10. So I was like, well, that's shifted really quickly. But of course, by the end of the game, I don't know if any of us three expected a 47-10 win. I expected it to win, but I thought it would be a dogfight just because playing there historically, Indiana has struggled. Yeah. But it's just, I don't know how to describe it. I know Galen and Scott on Crimson Cast said this before a week or two ago. It's getting difficult to put into words. It's almost emotional when you think about it, because as Indiana fans for so long, it's a really cool feeling to see them 9-0, and hopefully now, especially after a couple of other top 10 teams lost, I'm hoping that Indiana maybe ushers itself into that top 10 ranking, and it'll be cool to see what the college football playoff rankings. I think that comes out this week too, doesn't it?
This is the first week of them, yes.
Yes, that's what I thought. So I'm sure all of us Indiana fans will be checking that out as well. But I am psyched. I'm very, very happy about yesterday. How did both of you feel?
Yeah, well, I was like you. I got down when the team got down 10-0. Strangely, I didn't feel quite as let's say nervous as maybe past regimes for IU football. I assumed IU would score at least more than 10 points, so I knew they could at least get past that the marker. But yeah, 47-0. I was actually speaking of history, I was texting someone separately. I said that 47-0 run was probably the worst 2-hour beatdown done to a team of Spartans since the Battle of Leuctra.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man,
IU being Thebes in this.
Thebes, yeah. Along those lines, we are conditioned, and I think part of it is I remember in 1987, and I remember breaking my parents' piano, blasting out a version of the IU fight songs. I was so mad that IU was not going to go to a Rose Bowl. Just watching them just get clobbered and just banging the fight song out on the piano, and then I broke a couple keys, because you can actually hit a piano that hard when you're a kid. And I look back on this whole thing and 10 points used to seem like, okay, now the here we go again mindset that we've had since forever. And you don't have that now. It's hard, I think, the older you are to beat it out of you a little bit, because I mean, I kind of, you got the vibes on Twitix or even Facebook, or just with casual conversations that you get to be a part of, where people were genuinely worried, going, well, now how are they going to respond? Well, how we respond, this is, I guess the ride's over. And how do you respond when you're 10 points down? 47 unanswered, and you basically use their quarterback as a tackling dummy. I mean, the backbreaker is they screwed a punt up in the end zone where IU gets the safety. So for the middle of halftime to that play, I go across the street to check the door of the gym where I coach, because I wanted to make sure I got it locked. Every once in a while you go through that. Robbie, you work in a school, it's like, did I lock the door?
Yeah, you start having second thoughts.
I got to go back, and it's like they'll get the lights out and everything. So I go back, take my son over there. We walk over, ran into to one of the teacher's husbands, who was one of my old baseball coaches. By the time I got back, it was another 9 points on top, and you're like, how? The only way that could happen, they had to have gotten a safety. Holy crap, they got it. And then you go back and you look at it going, yeah, this thing's over. And in a good way. So it's just nice. It's nice to hear like IU chants going through the opponent stadium versus Memorial Stadium. When I started hearing the Hoosiers chants going on, let's go Hoosiers chants. I've been in Memorial Stadium when OHIO is going on in your own stadium, and you're like, this is just embarrassing. I want to leave and never come back. So it's one of those deals where, it's interesting. It's kind of a weird little deja vu, which is wonderful to be feeling now.
Yeah. It kind of proves one thing. I think we've been talking about the whole idea of culture in sports, and the question of whether culture emanates from the program or does it emanate from the leaders. And obviously there's debating theories about, which one is more important. I think with Cignetti, I think you would say that in this particular case, it does prove that if you have a coach that has a very defined sense of culture, that person can change the culture of a program rather significantly in a very short period of time.
Agreed.
Oh, yeah.
Because remember, like, how many times when we hear the debate about, bringing in a particular coach, it's going to take so much time to get the culture turned around. It's going to take maybe a few years to get it done. Well, with the right coach, years can really just be months.
Guys, especially with our topic today, like if you add the caveat of NIL with a strong, like, centralized leader like that can distribute responsibilities effectively, like Cignetti, you can have a pretty quick change. And I know, Bob, before the show, you had an interesting discussion that I think correlates to what Mike was just bringing up there, is about that central authority, because Mike brought up a culture change, and all three of us, I think, and we're all avid like followers of history. Usually you think culture changes are slow, like it takes over time. And I think you say like it has to be like adopted more by the masses, by the population, to be able to have it successful. So I'm kind of curious, Bob, like, how do you feel like, I don't know, in what way, like, how do you believe that Cignetti has been able to pull this off? and I know he wouldn't just give credit to himself. He's always very keen to give credit to his staff and other people too. But you know how the culture has been for IU football fans. How do you think he's been able to do that as a centralized leader, given the logic that you gave earlier?
Delivery. And I think that's the first start, is that he came in saying, Google me, I win. Okay, let's all talk Civil War. How did Grant do it differently than Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker, George McClellan, George Meade? Why was Grant different? Because after his first defeat, he didn't go back to Washington and regrouped. He just moved forward. Mm-hmm. Cignetti set the tone in such a way by delivering the way that he delivered. And it's never been about belief. It's never been about hope. It's never been about, we're going to turn this, I have a process. I have a plan. We're going to do this. Now, had he come out and it's 5-4, let's say it was 5-4, I don't think you see this, obviously.
Yeah.
But because because the program's at 9-0, because they keep showing competence, they're showing that it's like, okay, we put a lot into this. Now for the fan base, we need you. And what he did was he actually did it kind of different than most coaches that we've dealt with, which is first he says, we're going to do it on the field and in the practice facility. And then I'm going to call on you as the fan base of like, hey, if you haven't noticed, your team's 4-0.
Yeah.
You need to get your ass to the stadium and watch them. And you don't need to leave in the middle of the game, and you don't need to go out and tailgate at halftime. We'll get the beer problem fixed, so there'll be your concession lines will be shorter. That's how I think he's done it, is through competence, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that I think in a cultural type of thing, when you talk about changing a culture, I think the modern coach, and what we're going to do here, Mike, I'm just going to go ahead and jump through this. I'm going to finish this up. If you want to throw in the home field thing right after this.
Yeah.
And let's just get into this because we're here.
Yeah.
And and by the way, basketball season starts this week. Officially, we've had 2 exhibition games. They look good. Okay, so moving on. I think at this point, the big part of this is you have to kind of come in and just show that you're worthy of the investment. And I think the modern coach has to show that now more than anything else. Like I think when Mike and I, when we first started talking about this years ago, it was a coaching change has to show that through their recruiting. They have to go out there and they have to build a 3-year process. The Cignetti model might be they have to go in there and say, okay, I'm going to get a winner on the field now. Mm-hmm. And we're going to show that we're going to 180 this now. And we're going to show our competence. We're going to show our, not just competence, we're going to show our efficacy. We have a high level of efficacy early on versus it's going to take us a few years.
And also like the portal obviously helps with that because Cignetti was unique in that he could bring in a few, let's say some acolytes who were already bought in, add James Madison to IU. So
he had a top 25 team.
Yeah,
he had a top 25 team.
Very much for them. Whereas in the past, you had to convince every single guy, like, oh, everyone I have a new relationship with. Mm-hmm. But if you can bring in that many starters from a school where you already had a pre-existing relationship with, that definitely greases the tracks a little bit compared to the old model.
And if you can bring in a quarterback like Rourke with the experience that he has, and Indiana hasn't had that, so it just further adds to the JMU players. And it's just impressive that you can take so many different pieces from different locations and be able to have that chemistry together. It's just been, you almost have to pinch yourself because I think there is a part of all three of us, not to sound nihilistic or anything like that. There's a part of all of us that's waiting for when is the honeymoon end, because you still want to pinch yourself a little bit. And I think we need to give ourselves a break. Like, we can enjoy this. I can't remember if it was Galen or them, but we should give ourselves a chance to enjoy this without always saying there's a but. There doesn't always have to be a but every time we enjoy that.
And I agree with that. I found myself saying that a lot, Robbie, where I'm like, don't use the conjunction. Just say, it's fun. It's fun. Enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of fun, home field apparel. I mean, every time you go on that website, that's a lot of fun, right, Mike?
Yeah. So they dropped that snazzy IU football 1979 tri-stripe crew neck recently that was made famous by Coach Lee Corso. And that was a limited release, right? Because I think in like 48 hours, that thing was it was listed on the website as sold out. Mm-hmm. And I believe you got in just under the time limit, Bob, to grab
maybe one. My wife might be, because I sent it over to her, so she's looking for Christmas gift ideas. Yeah. So we'll see, but I have a feeling that eventually, if this thing sells, they're gonna, if you're a good capitalistic society, I could see there being a second release at some point in time. Exactly. Granted, it's like getting the second release of On the Road, but I still think that still having it, second edition of that, it can still work. But
we would definitely encourage people to just keep checking out Home Field on their website and also social media, because the gear is flying off the shelves as soon as it comes available. So definitely make sure to keep up with their drops.
And if you haven't done a quarter zip or a sweatshirt yet, as I'm wearing one right now, I'm telling you, the thing, they feel just as good, in long sleeves as they do in short sleeves. So Home Field, again, www.homefieldapparel.com, and check out what's new and what's there.
Yep. And when we come back, we'll jump right in, explore NIL and how college athletics has evolved in this new post-amateur landscape. Next on X's and Joe's.
So welcome back to X's and Joe's, and we have Robie Malcomson from the Hoosier Heartland podcast from a few years ago, as well as Hooked on History, I believe, as the his podcast he's currently doing. And I think one of the things that's always interested me on athleticism, and even thinking about the early 20th century, thinking about a historical construct, is the idea of amateurism. And what amateurism really meant. Like, if we start talking about teaching a concept from multiple perspectives, what did amateurism mean to a kid whose parents were German? They were German immigrants. He's first generation German immigrant, like a Lou Gehrig. What did amateurism mean to a Jim Thorpe, who was Native American, who was at the Carlisle School under Pop Warner? What did it mean for someone? What did amateurism mean for someone who was at Harvard in 1920 or, in London for Chariots of Fire? So I think the whole idea of, as we've looked at NIL, this name, image, likeness conversation that we're starting, and this problem with revenue, people are that it's not really even a problem. It's a changed paradigm inside college sports. This battle of, well, why are they playing it? Are they doing this for the fun of the game? Are they looking to be professionals? Are they looking like what does this look like? And so how does this, and I guess I'll start kind of just kick back to you guys on this. What does this really, where are we, do you guys currently think right now in this conversation as to what amateurism really is?
Well, I'll say that, it is an interesting evolution because I personally think amateurism is, you think about amateurism in the sense of the legal definition versus like the practical definition, right? Sometimes we think of it in terms of age. Well, they're too young to be professional. Well, they're child actors that were being paid reasonably well when they're like 6 years old.
Jackie Coogan.
And they didn't always work out very well, but they were paid. And so
Judy Garland.
So yeah, I think that people put a framework around this. I think that just doesn't necessarily match the reality of the actuality of the legal standing that these people have. The way I look at it in terms of like why it evolved is very similar to what you've seen in other, let's say, other paid environments when it comes to like amateur athletes, and especially with college players, let's say that played college football or college basketball. They're very similar to me to, let's say, doo-wop singers in the 1950s. So you think about what happened with so many of those early recording artists. What was true about them? They were paid. They were not working for free. What was also true is they're being vastly underpaid for what actual value is. So we always have these frameworks of saying, oh, was it like indentured servitude? Well, not really in college. Indentured servants didn't have a meal plan. They have a nutritionist 24/7 making sure they're healthy. So it's not like that.
Right.
But at the same time is that just because they weren't indentured servants didn't mean they weren't getting screwed.
Right.
And they were. And so what NIL is basically just bringing things back to people's actual market value. You are worth X in the open market. Now we're eliminating the rules that say you're not allowed to earn X.
And before I will quickly throw out this observation as you were explaining all this, Mike and Robie. I'd like to just kind of think about how we're going to kind of what this next possibility. We're now living in a world where in 2024 we had to do a GoFundMe drive for Mary Lou Retton,
right?
A 16-year-old that was on Wheaties boxes for representing the United States in Los Angeles.
Good point, Bob. Yeah,
and you talk about and she had to stop being a gymnast in 1984 so she could go on a Wheaties box to make enough money so we could now, using her name, image, likeness construct, now have to give her money basically give her money so she could get healthcare treatments.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
It's crazy. Yeah,
that shouldn't happen. I mean, it's mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, Robbie, I mean, really, is there any other? Can you think of anything else where that would even be seen as being normal? You know what I mean?
I don't think so. Like I can't. I didn't even know about that when you brought up the Mary Lou Retton thing. That shocks me because I remember how big she was.
Yeah.
Could you imagine back then, whenever she was extremely popular? Could you imagine the amount of revenue she could have generated with her individualism if she were allowed to? And I know the only thing I can find a connection to is how we had previously, before the show, talked about Jim Thorpe. And I know that's 1912, but that is another Olympic athlete that, unbeknownst to him, in 1909 and 1910, he's playing minor league baseball. And he doesn't know that in 2000 or 1912, he's going to have his medals removed because he wasn't supposed to be able to have that. To me, I think, and I think you two would agree to an extent, is that human beings have an intrinsic value. And I think that time matters. Like, people forget that time is a valuable, it's a disposable value in a way. And I think if you're devoting your time, no matter what age you are, because Mike brought up a great point about child actors. I think if there's a capitalistic demand for your value, then you should be compensated for that one way or another. And whenever I was thinking about this, and not to go down a different rabbit hole, Bob or Mike, on this, but whenever you all were going, I was trying to think about this historically and to see if it is defensible at all. So the concept of amateurism, do you think that whenever it's first coined, whenever leisure time is becoming more popular during the Industrial Revolution, I guess you'd say at the turn of the 20th century, sometime around that time period, do you think amateurism made sense historically at the time? Or do you think from its original coined concept, do you think it ever should have been a thing? Because obviously I would say today in our consumer economy that we have now with like social media and the way that you can market yourself, amateurism just doesn't make sense anymore. It's an outdated mode. But I wonder for you two, do you think historically did it make sense? Did it make sense in 1912?
I'm going to jump on this real quick, and Mike, because I don't want to jump you here too much, but because you just you kind of asked the question of what I was thinking about yesterday, getting ready for this nationalism and industrial revolution, and you start thinking about class in Victorian to Edwardian England in particular, or consolidating Italy, Germany in those times. Why would you put your working class kids on soccer and rugby teams and your elite kids get to play individual sports? Because you're trying to maintain a culture, a hierarchy where individualism matters for someone with title and privilege. And everybody else, if you're going to excel there, you get to be the sergeant, but you're never going to be as, quote, good. Remember, Jim Thorpe is sitting in the Stockholm Olympics while George Patton is also competing in, was it the heptathlon? Was it the pentathlon? The pentathlon.
Yeah.
Which was basically a warrior.
Yeah. Pistol shooting involved.
Yeah, all of that. And so when I think about that, Robbie, I think from the standpoint of 120 years ago, 130 years ago, pre-World War I, when we start defining this. So when Jim Thorpe is playing minor league baseball, but when Jim Thorpe shows up to Stockholm and kicks everybody's backside, now it's a problem, a big problem, because now all of a sudden this kid from Carlisle Indian School, who we've been trying to assimilate to look like the rest of, to try to assimilate into what we considered American, now all of a sudden has shown that, well, maybe this sort of superiority isn't all that. And I think Jesse Owens and Mac Robinson in Berlin in 36, similar type of situation. You start going down you start kind of going into those sorts of early amateurs. Now they've actually kind of trumped over the idea that your elites are elite in every way. That anybody can be elite in something. It doesn't matter what your upbringing or your parents' lineage is.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true, Bob. And also, in addition to that, you always had to think about what were the decision makers scared of at the time? Because oftentimes when you're making rules, you're scared of something. It's like, we don't want that to happen. And in sports around that time, players earning money was bad because that usually meant they're being paid off by somebody. Remember the Black Sox happened.
Yeah.
Right.
The world of sports. I mean, people don't get how big a deal that was about the idea of, oh my God, the players are getting extra money. And so this linkage between money and players has not always been a positive one. And so a lot of times the decision makers back then, I think, were really probably overcompensated for that fear by just saying, okay, we're just drawing this big fat line between the pros and everyone else.
But if Charlie Comiskey wasn't a tight ass, that wouldn't have been a problem.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, free agency, that's not a problem. A reserve clause causes a problem here in many respects.
Yeah.
So
well, that's go ahead.
Oh, I have a follow-up for you on that then. So if that is the case, the people in power have something to lose, and they're the ones that are setting these expectations and standards. Mm-hmm. Do you think that as we see the rise in the role of media from like the 1920s, especially the 60s and 70s, but especially as the way it is today with the TV contracts and things going on. Mm-hmm. So, these people that are in power, they have even more to lose. So I would think in theory, it becomes even more difficult to remove the title of amateurism or student athlete whenever these powers have much more to lose in this case. So do you think that only became further exacerbated over time because the consumer demand for the sport, especially the media getting involved in the sport? Do you think since that increases over time, does that make the problem even worse?
Yeah, I mean, well, and I said, when you think about, let's say, the opportunity cost, let's look at it from the standpoint of the players. You could make an argument, let's say, back a few decades ago. Let's say when coaches were making low six figures, bowl games were just paying out a couple $100,000 for the winners. And the TV contracts were in, let's say, the low 7 to 8 figures. You look at that in terms of the total pool of money out there, then room and board plus tuition isn't necessarily a terrible deal.
No.
But when the coaches start making millions and the TV contracts broke into the billions, then the players' opportunity cost was way, way more. I mean, they were literally getting screwed by many multiples compared to what their predecessors, decades before. And it became a problem, I think, just from the, there's the moral question, obviously, because the debate's been going on a while. I remember I watched some ESPN thing back in maybe the late 90s. It was like a panel about should players be paid. And I remember Chris Webber and Gene Stallings got into this like heated argument on stage.
I love it.
But how dare you not let me be paid? It's like, well, how dare you ask for money? And I just say the legal standpoint, if outside of sports, just in any sort of legal arrangement, appellate courts get very snappy-footed if you're restricting compensation opportunities for your associates, and you don't have a very good reason for it. And falling back on tradition is not a very unwise defense. You never lead with, well, we've always been screwing our employees.
Yeah.
So we've been doing it for decades. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Never lead for that because again,
wait, Mike. You mean citing the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory as being your model is not a good idea if you're sitting in front, if you're arguing labor law.
Exactly.
I'm just shocked. I'm going to fall out of this.
We've always chained the doors. The chaining the doors is always something we've done. This was a standard.
A standard of practice. We can't have our people steal it.
Yeah.
And
sorry,
you're right,
Mike.
Earlier you were mentioning, that we are a free market country, and the laws are designed that way. The courts enforce that any way they can. So if you're an institution that's benefiting from a market, but you're restricting that same benefit to your associates, well, you're going to lose eventually. You can't play these in our system. You can't play these games of capitalism for me, communism for thee. And unfortunately, that's exactly what the schools and the other associations were doing.
I'll throw this question out to the two of you guys here. What happens when you hand $100 million to a philosophy graduate student and a driver's ed teacher and tell them, "Hey, make a good decision on it"? And I mean that. I'm not saying it to be derogatory towards university presidents and university athletics directors, but maybe it is sounding derogatory. But when you really think about how you rise up in both of those hierarchies, you're never really going, you don't get to the top of those professions figuring out things like labor law. Like for a university professor, here's a scary thing. If you're a university, not professor, excuse me, president, you have implications on NIL. If you start talking about revenue sharing and fair compensation for your athletes, what happens when, can you apply those exact same arguments? Mike and I talked about this, the exact same arguments to your graduate students who are teaching your classes, who are doing your research assisting, who are asking for livable wages. It doesn't matter anymore that you guys pledged poverty. And when you were going through your graduate work, it doesn't matter if that, because that wasn't right then and it isn't right now. Why are you expecting us to accumulate $250,000 of debt or whatever to do this for you with the possible payoff of tenure, a tenured position? That's the argument on the other side of this, that graduate student side of it, which is now it's like, well, hey, if we are here working, doing a lot of this, basically keeping costs low for you guys. No, we want equitability. We want to be compensated fairly for our work. So in many respects, it's almost like that just makes the wire on how you create the solution all the more difficult, because whatever you say on one may get applied to the other. Mm-hmm. And God forbid you let the courts, or hey, you never walk into a legislative body and say, hey, solve our problem for us to the United States Congress or any state or 50 state legislatures. Oh, hey, we can't figure this out. Can you guys do it for us? I mean, at that point, it's like, you might as well just hand them a bunch of dynamite and say, good luck.
Yeah. Because they're so effective at doing that.
Yeah. That's not, they're like, oh, well, you said you wanted a solution. Yeah, but why am I standing in a rubble pile, right? Yeah. So that's kind of the question.
Bob, do you think that some of this, when I was doing my research, I kept seeing these two words often come up a lot, is that for many of these universities, they had this idea called the educational mission.
Right.
So they kept considering, like, what is the educational mission of students, that the academics should be prioritized over the athletic sport. But the problem is, the academics are not much bringing in the money. The sports are on it as well too, and you're basically exploiting them. So you're exploiting these people for. And you brought up the graduate thing. And I'll just finish with this, Bob. Please. Is that do you feel like, but the argument on the other side, has it always just been about the experience? That hey, the value that you're getting transcends the financial compensation you can receive. You're doing this work for free, because this is the experience. You're getting all this experience, which may add to your likelihood of getting tenure later or some other opportunities. But the problem is, aren't you still in theory exploiting these people for their time and labor?
Which was the question with Netscape at Illinois in the 90s. I mean, it's like those guys figured it out. It's like, we don't really need you. We've got something that's going to make us billionaires. And the university said, they did that using our stuff. We got a problem. So then all of a sudden the university started jumping into this idea of, we can't be like Illinois. We've got to figure out how we're going to create partnerships and create legal frameworks so that our research facilities and our graduate students aren't out figuring out how to make billions using us. Now, that being said, I always think that there's this kind of this weird dichotomy. Like Herman B. Wells had Phil Dickens. John Wooden had Sam Gilbert. You have these, this sort of thing where it's like, there's always this sort of yin and yang that's even existed in this sort of area where, I think the experience has been vital, has been kind of part of that area, which is, we're going to help you figure out how to get there. But if people could figure out how to do it without going through the stops. So like when Phil Dickens, it doesn't work out basically because other people got mad at the fact that he was doing what they were doing in the Big Ten, and they used power structures to slam him down. Gilbert eventually becomes ineffective because everybody else started figuring out what Sam Gilbert was doing, and they started doing it just in other locations. So, the yin and yang on both of those areas really kind of progressed everything. But I think if you kind of, and as we look at this moving forward, the question, I think, Mike, and I'm going to kind of throw this out to you also, because we were there, our friends did similar things, which was they figured out how to make money without going through the whole systemic, pay all your dues, do everything this way. How do you you're taking a risk. And I think part of it also is if you're an athlete, you're taking a risk. Would you, Mike, would you agree with that it's like playing college sports is a risk for the athlete?
You mean like in the physical sense?
All of it. Like if you pick the wrong institution, like if you go to Alabama and you're a 4th-string running back in Alabama, could you have made the pros if you had gone to, UTEP?
It's obviously the individuals are making choices, right? And the question is, are they making choices within an open or constricted space of opportunity? And I think the problem in the past is that the restrictions were always imposed on the players, and it was always to the benefit of the institutions. So again, that's why the courts basically stepped in and said, okay, NCAA, what you're doing is literally an antitrust problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're restricting competition. You're gearing the game in such a way that you're always coming out on top and they're always taking the risk. So you're right, Bob. I mean, for the players, the risk have always been present, right? Injuries, going to the wrong place, having some kind of god-awful experience with maybe one of the coaches or even the physicians. We see what happened at Michigan State.
Right.
So all those have been out there before. And just what's been the trade-off? Well, the trade-off is, in theory, they're bringing in so much money, but who's actually getting the money? Well, the institutions are, and the kids weren't. So I think it became over time, just as these examples came up, I think people just have an innate sense of fairness. And even if people don't really understand all the mechanics around the legalities of NIL, I think people just understood at a very basic level, oh crap, these people are bringing a lot of money and they're not getting any of it. And it's literally just that simple.
And that's where Curt Flood comes into play, because I think the similar conversation where it's like, and this is where there's a distinction between the portal and NIL. There's a clear distinction, I think, between the two. In reality, all NIL really, I always thought NIL was, okay, my name, image, and likeness, not necessarily my playing performance.
Right.
So, and that's where, again, because the NCAA has kind of not been able to figure out how to do anything with this, as they've created an environment where you've created an absolute open market, along with the transfer portal, where now you have free market. It's just a free. And would you agree, Mike? And Robbie, it's a total free market now. It's an unregulated free market.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, the NCAA says you can't use NIL as an inducement to commit. That's the one restriction, I guess.
But do you think that happens a lot behind the scenes?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're still going to have the story of the car dealership saying, "Hey, we'll give you this new car under the table." You know what I mean? If you're strongly encouraged.
The easier question is, where is it not taking place?
Yeah.
The Ivy League.
Yeah.
The Ivy League, right?
Or Army, Navy.
Army, Navy. Yeah, those places.
Well, here's an interesting follow-up question. How long do you think they'll call it NIL? Because you think about it, NIL's it's not really a thing. No. When people think of NIL, they think there's this special office somewhere with NIL written on top.
No,
they have this big multi-billion-dollar account somewhere that is just distributing cash to kids. They get this special NIL money. Well, NIL's not. No. It's not a thing. I mean, think of it. When Tom Selleck sells reverse mortgages on commercials between reruns of Magnum PI,
right? There's
no acronym for that. This is marketing.
Actually, there is an acronym for that. No, there was a term for that. I think I think it's called fraud. I mean, there is.
But Mike, I'll ask you to help, I'll answer your question by asking you one, and that is, if you think the college sports becomes eventually either professional or semi-professional, they structure it like the European leagues or something like that. Do you think eventually the NIL title fades away? Because obviously, what you do then on your free time, I mean, obviously you still represent your team. If you do something that's inappropriate, you're still under some kind of contract potential, and you still represent that organization. But I wonder if there really is an NIL, if it is like professionalized, because then if you do those commercials or that movie or whatever you're doing because your likeness, it doesn't really need to be labeled anymore. It's just something that's always been done in the past.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, I think it's one of these problems of the news. It's like, why does everyone know the names of the middle names of serial killers or assassins?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's because when they're first read on the news, the police always mention the middle name. That's why John Wayne Gacy, right? Because it's just this is what the police do, and the newspapers pick it up. It's the same with NIL. Why do we know NIL? Is because every single news report mentions NIL. What is it? It's just marketing money. The kids go out, they engage in a standard contract with like a car dealer or whoever. But that's what anyone can do. That any person has even a sliver of fame or notoriety can field calls from a business that wants to pay them to make some kind of appearance in some kind of marketing program. And that's been true for everyone except student athletes and certain members of the government and the military. They're the only people that ever had a restriction on that. So yeah, I mean, it's just, we're calling it something just because it's kind of new to us. And so it's just fresh on our mind, and that's what's been labeled in the court cases. Now, what's going to be interesting is what happens once, because NIL deals just with marketing. That's what the whole Ed O'Bannon versus NCAA case was. It's just about market. It's not about direct compensation.
Nope.
What happens when student athletes are basically determined to be employees? The Department of Labor defines them. They are employees. Then that gets really complicated and interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's where you have players associations, honestly.
And why you have collective bargaining and all that.
Yeah. And as an HR professional, I can tell you that's going to be a fascinating thing.
By the way, I'm going to say it again, to a group of people who are going, but what does that mean for this other whole larger group of people that we're getting billions in grant aid to keep on the payrolls?
Yeah.
Do you both think that, since I think it was 2022 when they've established, like it could be a little after that, when they established the revenue sharing policy, and I think that starts next year, right?
Yeah.
25 and 26. And I think it's 22%. Are they doing like a flat rate across D1?
Varies from
something like that.
Conference. I think.
Yeah,
the
Big Ten is,
gotcha. I think the Big Ten's looking at some of this like from some gender equity conversations. There's also factors into this conversation.
Yeah.
I think it's important to distinguish right now with some of the revenue, like the revenue coming into athletic departments. A lot of that money was actually utilized to expand their athletics department to incorporate women's sports, Title IX in particular. It was supporting the baseball team, supporting the wrestling team, supporting just those operations. So football was always the big one, and Murray Sperber, love him, hate him. For those of you who don't know, he is, Google him. He was an IU professor who basically pissed off the, I think he was out of hyper, wasn't he, Mike? Robbie, if you guys remember, Professor
he I think he was a history professor, and he wrote extensively about like Notre Dame. I mean, you think he wrote the book "Shake Down the Thunder" about the history of early Notre Dame. So I think he was a history professor that wrote about sports, I believe.
The Bloomington Faculty Council loved him, and the administration of Indiana University basically tried holding him in a closet. So it was one of those types of deals where he was really cool in academic circles. Fans were, he drove fans crazy. But the point about Sperber was he was like, look, your athletics department doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of money. The question is that there's too much, and this is back in the 90s, saying there's too much money in sports already. The real question becomes that we've lost touch with this. And in part, you start looking at, again, it was the apparel deals first, the video game deals second, the media deals third. You start going down, and all this money keeps getting dumped into these departments. At the same time, they're all trying to figure out how to get gender equity. Right. So what's financing gender equity? The football deal, your football tickets. So now we're at a point where the student athletes who are basically saying it. I don't think Ed O'Bannon would say, cut the wrestling team to pay me money. I don't think any of these guys would say that.
Yeah.
I think sometimes sports writers and some fans get confused going, well, why don't you just cut that and leave this here because they're the ones making it. I think that adds the complexity to it to a certain degree. That it's also a question where Mike Woodson makes $4.3 million a year, right?
Yeah.
The real question is Mike Woodson, and so now, but that's part of the issue also of like, or athletic, when we built this multi-million-dollar player center. Well, the player's saying, I don't need video game machines in a locker room for myself that you're showing off to recruits. I'll buy my own video game machine in my apartment or my condo that I can buy with my NIL, with whatever compensation I get via NIL or direct compensation from the department. Yeah. That I think becomes more the question. And then, I think this is where Ed O'Bannon, again, had a great point, because the other part of this was where I think the licensing really caused problems for the NCAA. They believed that they owned a player's name, image, and likeness for perpetuity. And institutions thought that. So the University of Cincinnati thought that they owned Oscar Robertson in a UC uniform from the time he put it on till the day till long after he had died. And so what was O'Bannon's case? It's 2009, and he sees himself in a video game with his number, and I'm not getting a dime. And everyone talks about Ed O'Bannon. Bill Russell and Oscar Robertson also joined the lawsuit to make the point. It's like, you're not just screwing over, the kids, the kids on the colleges right now. I'm 60 plus years old and I'm not getting a dime, and they're using me 70 years after. And why do people want to play San Francisco, the University of San Francisco, or why do they want to play the University of Cincinnati in this game? They're playing because of me. They want to be me in this game. Yeah. And you're denying me that, and you're giving my institution that money. And the reason they want to be me has nothing to do necessarily with what I did at San Francisco or Cincinnati. It has to do that I actually did this in the pros.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason you guys still follow these schools. Can you tell me who was on Cal's national championship teams back from the 50s? You can't.
Not easy. Yeah.
No.
You can't do it. I can't do it. Mike can't do it. Robbie, if you can do it, you get a Cupid doll. We're going to send you a Cupid doll in the mail. Yeah. But you can definitely tell me who, when, Russell, there's fans who can tell you about Russell and a Robertson.
Yeah.
And that's why those teams made the video game. EA made money. The institution made money. The NCAA made money. The player didn't.
Yeah.
So even if you argue that, Bob, even if you argue that, well, at the time when they were playing on those teams, they were an amateur, but you brought up a great point that, they even went on to play professional sports, but you're still using their likeness to be able to do that. And so it just seems so unethical to be able to think that you can get away with doing that and not compensate them. Because as Mike said earlier, any other adult in any other scenario outside of college sports would be compensated for that likeness. This reminds me of, I don't want to go too far down a different acting rabbit hole, but here in the last couple of years, you've seen the protests with actors, like a lot of B-rated actors and lower. So they're concerned with AI right now. A lot of these, I think, and I could be somewhat wrong here, a lot of the film companies are wanting to record their voice, their image, and their likeness that way. And then instead of filming full crowds and a background scene, I can just put you there, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you're going to pay this one-time fee for getting your likeness, and then they will just use it until you could. I guess theoretically they could use it after you're dead, and you and your family are not going to get any kind of compensation for that,
right?
And but again, it's pretty shocking. And then Bob, you brought up something earlier. I wonder, this would be purely speculation by all three of us, but do you think universities will try to compensate for a 22% revenue share? Do you think they will compensate by cutting some programs? And if they do you think, do the programs themselves or the individuals in them, do they have a legal standing to sue at all for Title IX issues if that were to happen? I just didn't know if either one of you two were to speculate. That might be too far of a speculation, but I don't know if that becomes a legal issue.
At this point, Galen Clavio is sitting on his treadmill right now, yelling into his yelling at his yelling, and his wife is going, "What are you yelling?" Because they're going there.
Yeah.
But in reality, and I would defer to several of the other folks on the network on this, but here's my base take on this where I think there's a risk inherent in certain non-revenue sports, especially on the male side, being cut. Yeah. And I think, that's for all the other noise around gender in sports right now, this is probably a bigger issue, that if you're a wrestler, if you're a swimmer, if you're a cross-country runner, even a baseball player could potentially be dealing with this. I think institutions are, but I think schools are going to have to get creative on how they fund that. The other thing is, you could take revenue sports, certain sports, out of that intercollegiate competition portion. Like, does it make sense to fly your cross-country team from Los Angeles to Rutgers for a dual meet? No, it just doesn't. So maybe it does. I don't know. But I think, it's really one of those questions of, do you now see an extensive new tier of club sports that Club Plus, where it's kind of outside of that, and you can get some granting or subsidization from there. I don't know how it looks. I think it does have a major change, because I think that we are making a differentiation in athletics. And Mike and I had this kind of kick this over to Mike real quick. It's like we had the question, Sanasia Lee, right? That's a gymnast who 4 years ago won the all around.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
and she did okay. She actually won some medals in this Olympics after some fairly major health issues. But remember when NIL first started, Mike, you and I were having the conversation in that because it was right during COVID, right after COVID, because the game played a year. She shows up on Auburn.
Yeah.
Well, she's a much bigger draw than any Auburn, where it's like football is God. How does that work?
For her being at Auburn, for her being at Auburn, and
she was there.
I guess it's hard just because the Olympics are almost like it's a separate entity in a way. Like we're talking about Mary Lou Retton earlier. I don't really know. I don't know how I'd answer that, because if we're talking about like Title IX, let's say, everything within Title IX is about equal opportunities and treatment. That's like the two main words. And there's a lot of leeway, let's say, that happens in between that. And so you're right, Robbie, that it could create problems, because you're right. I mean, if you start getting into where you're actually cutting out sports because of these like revenue concerns, you're creating at least the opportunity, like an opening for an attorney to step in and say, that's a problem, and we're gonna have to step in. You're right, Bob. I do remember that we were discussing that, and how did she? I'm trying to remember, what did she do after that? What were there some kind of like commercials or anything for her?
And I also think she did Dancing with the Stars. I can't.
Yeah, I thought she did something in that.
Along those lines.
And how old was, like, she was like a junior at Auburn or something like that at the time?
18, 19. She was going into her freshman year when she went. And actually, I think that those Olympians also helped propel women's college gymnastics into it. Because of NIL, they're able to, no one gets Mary Lou Retton anymore. No one gets Dominic Dawes anymore. You actually have a chance to go in and go to college and earn money and earn endorsement money.
Yeah.
Same with swimming. I mean, all those sports. Because the USOC figured it out. They figured out we can let these guys go on Wheaties boxes and do direct compensation. It's not killing it doesn't kill it. Yeah. If Michael Phelps is a multimillionaire, people are still going to want to watch the guy swim.
Right.
That was always the theory before. Well, it goes going back to Jim Thorpe. Going back, we have to maintain the integrity of amateur sports.
Yeah.
Even though the Soviet bloc countries weren't, we have to do this.
Yeah, it's funny. Just as a sidebar, you're mentioning video games earlier. Do you think they're ever going to forgive Ed O'Bannon for the fact that the EA Sports college football video game was discontinued for over a decade because of the O'Bannon case?
It's not Ed's fault. It's EA Sports who couldn't figure it out.
Yeah.
Now that Mike brings it up, I was thinking about this beforehand. Is that I remember being young, and whenever the case first happened, I remember naively being like angry at Ed O'Bannon for like bringing it up, because like selfishly I thought, well, they're just, instead of like starting to pay athletes, they're just going to cancel the games, because we grew up on doing that stuff. So you're right. So over a decade, there are no college sports games, and you have like a generation of young Americans that are not having what we all had access to on that stuff. But obviously now in retrospect, as Bob was insinuating there, that he's not the unjustified one. I know Mike was being facetious too with what he brought up earlier. This is something that the NCAA should have figured out. And obviously at the time, rather than figure it out, they'd rather just kick the can down the road and just got rid of the licensing with EA Sports altogether.
Yeah. My favorite, and you're right, Robbie, what makes the whole situation interesting is how flat-footed the NCAA got caught once the decision came down. It looked like one of those scenarios where you realize that there's two potential outcomes of something that happens, let's say at work, and there's the person that prepares for it, says, okay, if this decision comes down, I'm gonna have all my ducks in a row and make sure everything's going to be well prepared. And there's the other person that says, well, I'm not going to do anything. I just hope that the decision goes my way. Well, the NCAA looked much more like the second scenario, in that, oh God, now this is coming down. What do we do? And everything becomes scramble mode. And I think they're still scrambling to figure out like how to navigate all this with, especially just knowing the bonanza of money that can now be paid to players. And you just know there are people that work in the NCAA. They're probably just punching the walls every day, seeing the numbers that some of these kids are getting. Mm-hmm. Just knowing how restrictive they used to be in the past, and now seeing, my God, these kids, they used to make, room and board used to be just like 1/10 of my salary. Now these kids are making 10 times my salary. They're 18 years old.
Because anybody can do your job, and not everybody can hang off a rim. I'm sorry. That's called fairness.
Yeah, and people pay to watch somebody hang off a rim. People are not going to pay you to sit at your desk. So again, I don't see a problem with this. When you think of it in terms of like an economic way, like a free market society, there really shouldn't be any complaints for it. Another word that I kept seeing thrown up that I'm sure you two will scoff at meaningfully is I kept seeing the word purity pop up all the time. Is that, well, what will happen? Like, do you remember the panic originally? Is like whenever they first started talking about NIL, is this going to ruin the purity of the game? And I'm like, it's kind of like not to get political, because I know we have the election coming up Tuesday, but it's kind of like the saying, make America great again. And as a history teacher, you're often like, okay, so when was that? Like, when exactly would you say it was a utopia, like the entire time that we were going? But I get the rhetoric on that kind of thing. But also to add is that I think what Mike's bringing up, it goes really well back with what both of you said at the onset of the show, when you said, if you're going to stand back and use the old time excuse of tradition, and it sounds like that's what the NCAA just kind of leaned on, that like there's no way this is going to work. They're not going to win this. And then they're called flat-footed whenever it comes out. They were obviously not ready to amend anything.
Well, and again, I think it goes back to how baseball tried to defend the reserve clause. And then Curt Flood fought it. And in this era, not realizing that you had all these guys who, once you started moving teams, once the Dodgers moved from Brooklyn to LA, it was easier to say this player needs to move from the Dodgers to the Giants, because now you've already broken a social contract with those communities. Now you're just playing for a business, not for a community, if that makes sense. And so Curt Flood's going, if the owner can move the team, I can move owners. I would kind of throw that now that we're in an era where kids can be influencers, whether it's TikTok, whether it's whatever. I'll use TikTok because that's what the kids love, supposedly. They do.
Is that what the youngsters are using now?
Yeah. What the youngins are playing with that snap box or whatever they call it.
With their Pac-Man video games and hula hoops.
Right, exactly. They're just that and rockabilly music that they just enough of. Is anyone really an amateur in that world? Is anyone really an amateur when here's the thing, it's like if a kid drives Grubhub and they give him a $15,000 tip because he's also a really good running back. What are we into? And I think that becomes, as we go into the next segment, and after our break, the impacts of paid players, because this is nothing new, paying players. Whether it was a bag of cash handed to a kid in a duffel bag underneath in their locker, or it's a $15,000 tip on a Grubhub thing, or it's a GoFundMe page, whatever happens. Different institutions, different places, different people can influence that in different ways. And so does that mean the rich get richer? Does it mean that people can figure out how to innovate utilizing a new system? What are we seeing now? What do we speculate we're going to see in the future? So when we go back on X's and Joe's, we'll get into that.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, and I'm joined by Coach Bob Moats and Robie Malcomson. So now we get into the nitty gritty. Who actually has a leg up in this new environment? And it's not exactly breaking news that programs with rich donors, like let's say the Tyson family at Arkansas, it's not news that those programs are going to have a major impact in attracting talented players and coaches in this totally new environment. So that's the default assumption. Maybe the more interesting question becomes, what pathways exist for other programs that maybe don't have those kind of deep pockets? Or be it maybe like a mid-major program, or even programs that are Power 5 schools, but don't seem to have those kind of resources available to them. So maybe I'll put that to you guys just as an opening pitch. Like, how, if you were one of those other schools and you didn't have the Tyson family money available to you, how do you go about things? Well, like, where does that put you in a sort of like the competitive hierarchy?
So maybe, so some programs have been using this. Well, maybe you make your program more like you don't use this phrasing, but you consider it more like a minor league to the major Power 5 schools. Like, well, what our program will market to you is player development. We'll give you player development. We don't have the same kind of resources another place has. And like a good example would, like, look at Dalton Connect's like trajectory, like, where he played at originally, and then he like used that to leapfrog him to Tennessee, and then now he's starting off very strong for the Lakers. I mean, he's on the roster and he's been getting some significant shots. A young player that's considering a smaller university could still have that. You don't have to necessarily go to a UK or a Duke or something to kind of get that opportunity. One other reference here, and I know this is an FCS reference, but I always thought of, I'll never forget that game day about 4 years ago, I think it was, when they went to North Dakota State. I don't know if you guys remember that episode.
Yep.
So you have Fargo, North Dakota, and I think it's a great example just because I was looking at the socioeconomics and the demographics of that area. I don't know why I can't say Fargo without picturing the movie and all the quotes from it. It's like circling through my head right now.
The wood
Yes,
chipper.
that accent, the wood chipper, and I can picture like, you spilled Arby's sauce on me and stuff like that. But I do want to bring up that I think it's an interesting one to study, just because if you think in terms of North Dakota, they have no major sports teams nearby them, right? So they have a community that is strongly devoted to their university. And so I think maybe one of those ways, now I don't know, Mike, on how to exactly go by doing this, but maybe more of your pitch is, okay, so we're going to rely on NIL collectives and like local businesses, whether they're bigger or smaller, to kind of engage us. So we're going to really push this community issue there. It's not going to be on the scale of these larger donors, but maybe you make it more of, this is truly a utilitarian effort. It's a utilitarian effort that the whole community is part of that. And I noticed that there were several tech companies that were nearby on North Dakota State and others that they've got to collaborate with them and invest into it. And I know that they have success too. Obviously at the FCS level, they've been able to build a consistent successfulness to build their culture over the years. But there's one of those lower programs. I don't know if you would count them as a mid-major, obviously, but they seem to have a pretty strong community there. or someone like a Boise State. Boise State's another one that's you every time you turn around, they're always in the top 25, but you don't consider them like a powerhouse kind of school, but they're somehow able to do it. Like, how are these kind of schools doing it? Maybe that's something that you and Bob know better strategically on that. But I just tried to do a small case study on just North Dakota State, just because culturally it's just very interesting to me to see how a seemingly isolated community from professional sports can rally around and then use that community image as like a utilitarian effort to build that program and maybe get some NIL opportunities out of that.
So just a side note before I'll let Bob jump in, but there's a lot of money in Boise. Don't underestimate how much money is in Idaho. It's not just potatoes.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Box tie, right? Is that another thing I'm thinking? Wait, what am I thinking of?
Yeah.
Did I hit that? It's like, when I start thinking about, mountains have lots of stuff people want in them.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is kind of the overall point. Universities are really, 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 really good at getting money out of people. They're incredible at it. And it's funny because we're kind of watching this happen again in different applications and endowments. Why are we endowing this and not endowing direct student aid? Or putting our endowment money towards direct student aid versus, let's say, an endowed chair for this or an endowed this building for that sort of thing. And universities love bricks and mortar because old people love bricks and mortar. And in a world where bricks and mortar aren't nearly as essential as it used to be, can you find a way to just get money? Can you find a way to recalibrate your fundraising efforts to, get a few million here or there just to be able to compensate athletes? I think for the high majors, I've already seen this from a couple programs. Don't build me a new practice facility. I don't need it anymore. In reality, it's a sunk cost fallacy for many of these places because we put $60 million into a place that has the state-of-the-art toilets for our student athletes. And the recruit goes, okay, so that money could have come to your current point guard. Why didn't it?
I think we call that the T. Boone Pickens fallacy.
Right.
But Bob, what if all those toilets have bidets installed on them? Is that not a perk that a player would be interested in?
I'll employ my own guy. I'll bring my own portable bidet with me with my NIL with my NIL revenue sharing money. I'll endorse a bidet and they'll give me one.
Hire a porter.
Right. I mean, it's like that. I think it's like, and that's how abruptly this has changed, because we used to hear about IU. Well, the facilities are causing us not to get recruits. Well, it's kind of when China decided that they needed to. Well, China's going to be generations behind the United States because they're not hardwired. And so how are they going to be able to telecommunicate? They just went cellular. So you skip out this massive infrastructural necessity. Oh man, how's Africa going to figure out how to do waste, deliver clean water? And then we all seen the Bill Gates, super sewage machine. It's like you can find a way to innovate yourself out of that sort of fallacy, that sort of trap. And I think programs are doing it as they're currently doing it.
Yeah.
So do you think they're doing it over time by finding out what athletes truly care about? So rather than the brick and mortar aspects, because I remember those arguments, and man, it wasn't even really that long ago. I remember some of our fellow podcasters were bringing up concerns about our facilities 5-6 years ago, but I wonder what athletes care about. And your logic it almost reminds me of, like, whenever you're gift giving somebody and they, rather than give me a sweater I'll never wear, why don't you just get me a gift card or money and then I'll just go buy what I want?
Right.
So why not give the point guard just the money for their value and let them decide naturally to get what they want on that? So maybe that's kind of where we're going, and maybe that's what universities and especially these mid-majors have to figure out.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy, Robbie, just FYI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I knew it'd be in the holiday spirit. I'm trying to send a message to my relatives. Don't give me a sweater. Just give me some hot cash wrapped in a gift, and that'll be.
I don't like alpaca. I mean, it just doesn't feel good on me. I know some people love it.
Yeah. I don't need a higher thread count. I just need to get some money.
So sometimes those Donnie Brasco Christmas parties are the best. Just like, here's 500 for you and 500 for me.
So, but I think I think for mid or below majors also and we were talking about this, I think right before, like Indiana State. I don't know if we brought them up yet, but what they did was you get a really good up and coming coach. You get him out of what I think he came from D2, right, Mike? Right, Robbie?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he did.
Lower level. Yeah,
guy can coach the game. He spends all of his time watching film, trying to figure out how to innovate himself into it. He then creates his perfect island of misfit toys. Robbie Avila was a phenomenal marketing thing, by the way. Especially for that demographic and population. Mike and Mike's family.
If
my mom loved that guy.
If he didn't wear those goggles, a marketing person would have put him in those.
Yeah.
Like, kid, wear these. Believe me, it's going to be worth it for you. Yeah,
it's going to be huge.
Yeah.
But you create an island of misfit toys. You use the transfer portal, you use your limited NIL, and then you give everybody an opportunity to get off the island after a year after they showed themselves.
Yeah.
And you can have those like wildfire fire-ups, and then maybe the question then becomes, maybe you're able to get a higher level of recruit to come in and build your program with a new coach. Yeah. Those are kind of the sorts of things where you can see mid and even low major schools kind of looking at that. Because now, if I'm on Synergy, as long as I'm playing and coaches have Synergy access to me, they find a way, I find a way to break out. Programs are going to look at me, and my phone's going to start blowing up, and I'm going to start getting entry. People are going to start communicating. That becomes the other question of how do you deal with, what they call tampering now. Well, part of it just needs to be, okay, agents can now consult on, external opportunities. I don't think coaches really want to start working with agents on, negotiating for talent. So this becomes kind of the pathway kind of becomes there. It's like, you may only get them for a year or two, but you're already in that. You're with one and dones and with early interest, we're already in that environment anyway. It's just a matter of how do you explain that. I think Dalton Connect's a great example of that, where you also now have kids who can get in the game at the JUCO level or NAIA level and just work their way up. I think the question then becomes, why would you stay at an institution and wait your turn versus trying to get out, early? There's two ways of going there. If you have a chance of going to a really good institution like a Duke, a Kentucky, even at Indiana, and you can maybe get on the floor your first 2 years, maybe you go and make that choice because the NIL is good enough, maybe because the institution is good enough. But why would you go to Mississippi State and do the same thing?
Right.
Mike,
Bob.
Mike, would you go? What would be the draw to Mississippi State versus that? I mean, versus going to Louisiana Tech and being the man for a year.
I don't know if there's enough cowbell money coming from Mississippi State, maybe.
True.
So
maybe
Starkville's kind of a nice place. It's not bad. Our friend Matt Zimmerman used to teach there, so I think it's nice things to say.
Right.
No, you're right. We've been talking about this for a bit. Is that I think one of the episodes a few months ago we were talking about. Okay, well, you're a good player, but you're not a one and done. What is the advantage of going and sitting the bench at Duke for a year versus going to Mountain West and scoring 15 points a game as a freshman? And then the next year, what's going to happen? Now Duke is going to call that kid from the Mountain West and give him a scholarship and probably a starting position. Whereas the kid that's already at Duke, sitting the bench, is thinking, oh, well, I haven't been able to prove myself. Now what do I do?
And a lot
more
money.
Transition somewhere to get playing time and then to jump back in. So you're right that the route, Bob, is going to change. I think the biggest opportunity cost now is going to be felt by the kids that go to a school and sit the bench early and are not able to get a good they're not able to build up a resume.
And for old guys like that's a problem. But because we're like, well, you go to college and you stay there 4 years.
Yeah.
But Robbie, right. Are you finding, because I'm finding this too. I mean, I am literally within a bike. I can look out and see a college campus, 3 college campuses from my front window. Mm-hmm. The Air Park campuses in Columbus, which is IU, Ivy Tech, and Purdue. Purdue has a presence here too. Regional campus. Are you seeing this down with some of your students where they actually go community college for a year or two and then try to get themselves into a Lexington or into a Western or Eastern Louisville.
Oh, constantly. We constantly see that. There's lots of kids because I live 30 minutes from Western Kentucky University, so I'm just right down here. There are lots of kids that will go to like a smaller university, like a Campbellsville University or something like that, which often these universities are smaller feeder schools for the bigger one. Like a lot of kids will go to Campbellsville and then transfer to UK in Lexington or something like that. But you do see that a lot. You'll see them transfer from like a technical school to like Murray State or Western Kentucky. Definitely. That's you see that often. And it does seem like it increases more every year too.
So the marketplace is already changing, and guys like, so at the point when you see that big thing in the sky that's coming towards the earth, you realize that it's not a new star, it's a meteorite, and you better start stockpiling. Yeah. My question sometimes in life is, am I the dinosaur or am I the mammal, the little rodent? Yeah. I'm pretty sure I'm getting closer to being the dinosaur. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, me too. Well, hey, I have a devil's advocate question for you and Mike, Bob, based on what you brought up earlier. And that is, I kind of want to look at it. Not that I agree with this, because I agree with both of you. I like the fact that schools could look at themselves this way. But let's try to look at it maybe from the point of view of the fan, like the local fan, especially ones that are older like us three. So I think there was something that all of us, I think, used to appreciate about like the roster not having so much turnover. Because as a fan, you got a relationship you're building with these players over time. You have some familiarity there. And I've heard this complaint sometimes with like Indiana, whenever Crean had the good years of 2019 and 20, and then now with Signetti, that the fear is, and you could put this with any other mid-major program, if you're Indiana State or you're Indiana football and you're starting to do better consistently, oh my God, what happens? Now all the coaches will leave. The coordinators will get hired somewhere. The head coach will get hired somewhere better. Players will leave. Right. And will just become this revolving door of constant change. But I wonder for you two is, I want to ask you a question about sustainability. Do you think, for fans like that, they're maybe older, because I assume that you have some younger fans too, but a lot of your listeners may be like around our age. So a lot of us kind of maybe miss that familiarity there. So how could programs maintain a successful level of sustainability that can be enjoyable for the fans and not just beneficial for the athletes individually to have those? Because I want the athletes to have that choice to be able to go somewhere. But at the same time, what would you two say to the fans that are concerned about seeing a constant revolving door come through? There's not an opportunity to really get attached to this culture and these players.
Yeah, I would say that I think it's going to take some recalibrating of expectations for fans. I think when a lot of this things with the portal and NIL started popping up, the concerns that people had were exactly what you said, Robbie. Oh my God, it's not going to be like the olden days. I enjoyed watching Steve Alford play at IU for 4 years and develop from 84, 85, 86 and win a championship in 87. That's kind of the model. Now it is going to be a little bit more like the pros. And you almost have to, if you're a fan of professional teams, you almost have to take that framework and then superimpose it over college in a way that maybe you haven't before, and maybe in a way you didn't want to before. And so the reality is, and Bob used good examples like ISU, you have to enjoy it while you have it. It may be a revolving door, and it may be unavoidable to be that, but you have to have very strong support systems like the athletic directors. You have to make really good coaching choices, and you may get a bad hire here and there, but you have to think about it in the long term. It's just like, I'm a fan of this school, and hey, if kids want to come here, even if it's just for a short period of time, great. This is like the new model. I would say that the danger is, and this is maybe one sort of admonition I've had about this whole changeover, is that it is going to be more like the pros, but it's probably going to be a few examples where it's going to be maybe the worst side of the pros. Because I think donors, they're not going to be treated like owners. Mm-hmm. And if you're an owner of a professional sports team, like, just think, like, I'm not a big Chicago fan of any sports, but I'm around Chicago people. And there's a name that kept coming up in my childhood that I never knew these people. But the name that kept coming up, I remember during lunchtime in third grade was McCaskey.
McCaskey.
Yeah.
Well, who are these McCaskies you speak of? You speak of like they're, a standing trial at Nuremberg. And these McCaskies are the worst people ever. It's like, well, what did they do? Yeah. Oh, they didn't pay your linebacker enough. No. Now imagine if you're let's say you're a well-meaning, well-heeled supporter at Kansas State. You cobble together, let's say, $5 million, and you donate it to the school through some kind of NIL collective. You feel great about yourself, but $5 million is a lot to you. And the next year, someone who's 10 times wealthier than you is a KU donor, gives 5 times what you did. Mm-hmm. What do you think is going to happen to your name within, let's say, the Kansas State message boards? Oh God, we're getting absolutely creamed in NIL. Why aren't our donors giving more money? Then you become the McCaskies. Mm-hmm. All because you wanted to donate some money to help your program. You thought you were doing a charitable thing, but now, no, you're now in competition. And sometimes you're in competition with people that you cannot keep up with.
And remember, Virginia McCaskey and Mike McCaskey and all those guys were the ones. This wasn't a donation; it was an investment. That's a critical note about owners versus donor,
right? And
my other advice to people on message boards is realize this: that if rich people gave a damn what you said on a message board, they'd be shocked. It's like if you have $5 million to hand over to Jerome Tang, I have a sneaking suspicion that you're not worried what KU fan 69 says about you on Twitter. And if you do, just get off the stuff. You don't need it. You can buy new friends.
It's always 69, isn't it?
It's always 69. Always. Because it kind of speaks to the quality of individual that would actually post crap like that.
Right.
Would be someone who would put that in their name, hiding behind some stupid moniker. Yeah. Because they're, could be so they could just, I don't know.
Yeah.
Their job.
There's nothing more humbling than having your job questioned by Kitty Cat 69
exactly
on a message board.
Yeah, it's like consider the source. This person's miserable. The person's a bookkeeper at the White Castle Bun Factory. He takes crap from everybody. And his one thing, his wife's mad at him. His kids won't do what they say.
But Bob, you don't get it. He's a devoted fan. This is all he has. This is
all he has.
Don't understand. Yeah,
and they don't understand. And his only outlet is to abuse people on the internet.
Yeah.
Do we give this guy? No, I say just finish him off. But still, he's out there. She's out there. Whatever the pronoun is there. But I think this goes back to this. And I because I was kind of went on the rant, and it's really rarely when I go on the rant and I forget where I was going back to. Jerry Jeff Walker says the total Gonzo thing. So I'm going to go. The great American philosopher and poet Jerry Jeff Walker talks about how do you know if you've gone too far? Well, you do too much and you pull back. That's how you answer the sustainability question.
Gotcha.
It's actually free market economics 101. Everything, things go up, things go down. Markets find equilibrium. The COVID year goes away this year. So now we have a new portal where you're going to have fewer people in the portal. More programs have figured out NIL. More programs are going to be investing with revenue sharing. So they'll be able to tamp down certain athletes. Their highest producers, the high productivity guys aren't going to be as on the market as they were a year ago, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So the market finds equilibrium. The econ teacher says that. We learned that in high school economics. It's not pleasant. It's not always good. It's not always fun. But it will figure itself out. To Mike's point about this guy at $5 million, I'm less interested in the $5 million because the $5 million guy will be there everywhere, and at some point they're going to get tired of putting $5 million for 500 records. I'm more concerned about the $5 million donor doing one of two things. One, protecting their status quo, or two, and this is probably the bigger problem, which is now having more of a direct influence over what's happening on the field, off the field, and who's running the program. Not to say donors didn't have that power to begin with, but really you kind of knew, like when we talk about coaching 10 years, there's always telltale signs. it's not that anybody says, I'm going to stop giving you money. It's you start looking at the balconies and you start looking at the last rows of the stadium, and you start when you saw sellouts, now you see 80% to 70% to 60%. And now you're talking about true economic costs being dealt with and delved with. And then you can kind of predict that using the recruiting patterns, et cetera. I think that more and more programs are going to figure those. I think the institutions are going to figure this out, because they're going to know that we have to do the bare minimum. There'll be some institutions, I won't give the example, but I think you could guess as an IU fan who I would use right now as the example as to who will do the bare minimum on this and who will also basically do this in a way that's going to be traditional. They're going to cling to tradition. They're going to double down on tradition. They're going to double down on their type of, quote, player, their type of person, and they might sign the drum. I'll just say it that way. Purdue's going to do it. I'm just going to go right out and say Purdue is going to. Everyone's going to go this way. Purdue is going to go that way, because honestly, and they've said they're going to do it, and we've said this on the show multiple times. Purdue is going to do. They're not going to do too much. Yeah. So when water finds its level, will they be stronger? Will they be weaker? Will it work? Because if you have 50 people trying to cram into this space and 2 or 3 cramming into that space, I think Marquette's doing some interesting things with basketball. They're foregoing the portal. Shaka Smart's building his own culture. Some call it a cult, but it's really more of a culture, up there that really kind of works in with the type of play that they're doing. So I would say at this point, I don't know. I don't know. But I do know that I think that things are going to stabilize, and it's going to be more like baseball, where if you don't have a farm system, it's going to be really hard for you to succeed. Or basketball, if you don't draft well, it's going to be hard for you to succeed. Football, if you don't have the ability to cobble together your roster through varieties of sources, because free agency in football, if you're going free agency in football or trades in football, you're losing. And I think the same thing is going to apply to the college game as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're talking about. Yeah, it's a good point about Purdue, Bob, because I remember they were going after Nigel Pack very hard from K-State. And a lot of Purdue people thought, like, oh, he's coming here. And some people already penciling him into the lineup. And then out of nowhere, John Ruiz and the Life Wallet money came through. And now he's at Miami. So, and the first thing that Purdue fans said after they lost that tournament game is like, what if we had Nigel Pack on the team? I think we could have won that game. And that's exactly how pro fans talk about their teams when they lose in the playoffs. Yeah. Oh, God, you remember that in the offseason in free agency, we had the chance to get that number 1 wide receiver, and we didn't. And we lost the game by 3 in the playoffs. So I think that it's funny, like the conversations about sports are going to start mirroring what you see in the pros. Yeah. So that we're going to start talking much more like about recruiting, much more like free agency. Oh man, we had that one opportunity, that one guy. Why didn't we get them the same money that they got, at the place they eventually went? So it is very interesting. It's I think it starts with a change in mindset and expectations, and maybe some people will be able to make the transition. And so I think I've already talked to people that said flat out to me, I don't think I can watch college sports the same way. I'll still keep an eye on it, but I don't think I'll ever enjoy it the way like it used to be.
I had that conversation yesterday.
Yeah, like you said earlier, Mike, at the beginning of that question, you said it's going to have to take a pretty hard recalibration, because if you still value the sport, I think you can still find joy in it. I think if you try to resist change, it's going to continue to leave you behind. But in all this way, I will say, and maybe it's just me, I don't know if you two feel this way, I'm getting less and less excited about high school recruitment. But now whenever portal season opens up, I get like real excited for some reason. Like I get really interested. I'm checking X, like constantly refreshing and looking at that. And obviously Indiana had a good experience in football and in basketball on the portal one as well. But you brought up a great example of Shaka Smart. Like some people do the Dabo Sweeney thing. Like I'm gonna skip the portal thing altogether and just try to stick to my own culture thing. But I guess when it comes back to it, goes back to that quote. I can't remember who said it, but I know Indiana fans use it all the time. Is just win, baby. Like on that thing is like ultimately, I guess if you're winning games, then people will think that your strategy is working, whatever it is that's working on that. And if you're not winning games, whatever you're doing is terrible. So it could be as simple as this, that logic.
Well, and the question is, do you want to be the first, do you want to be first to market, or do you want to be the one that goes that the Warren Buffett strategy? I don't want to be first or last in, or first in or last out.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you want to just go ahead and be, Bill Gates and smash through the one, I'm going to smash through, how do you want to be, and also what is your fan base, your donor base, and your institutional, for lack of a better term, their capacity for risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you in a culture that embraces risk, or are you in a culture that embraces more security?
Well, hey, you're seeing it in the NBA too, because I'm an avid watcher of that. But you're seeing a lot of these smaller market teams that are getting criticized because, hey, you're not willing to go into the luxury tax very far. So if you're not, then it must assume your ownership doesn't care about the team, because it's almost become a standard now that if you're going to be competitive, you have to be deep into the luxury tax. But I want to ask one other question there, and I brought this up before the show. So, Bob, I know you brought up. I'm sorry. But I know you brought up about the 3-point line thing last week and the fast break thing about things changing. And it makes me consider this idea that one of the common complaints about NIL I've seen on my research is that, well, then there's not going to be enough parity. The bigger schools will still consolidate modes. So I wonder if the logic is, the more equity there is, will there be more parity? And I wonder what you two think about that. But I know we're going to transition on to another one, but that was floating in my mind too when we were going.
Let me jump real quick. I think parity is always a myth anyway.
I know, I agree.
And I think that's the first part of this, is that it's always an argument of, well, how do you level the playing field? I think NIL and IU football proves this, and we can talk about this after the break. But I think IU football has kind of proven that you can go there fast.
Right. Yeah, and reaching back to some of our old episodes, we talked about why do some programs have advantages? We talked about the historical advantages of having media attention. Just your name, your brand name is more front of mind for recruits. You're able to build larger arenas because your success in the 40s and 50s gave you more money. Like Bob said, now those historical advantages are going to start going down. They're not going to disappear, but they will recede. And some schools will have the opportunity to raise enough money, get a good coach, and truly level the field in a way that that's never really happened before, because there's just a lot of money out there, but there's never been that much prestige out there. Prestige was always unfairly shared in the market in the past, but now there's a lot of money out there that's much more, let's say, evenly distributed amongst fan bases. So when we'll come back, we'll wrap up discussing how these changes might impact IU in the 2025 season and beyond. Next on X's and Joe's.
And welcome back. Robbie kind of hit the nail on the head there a minute ago, saying, watching IU both in men's basketball and football. What IU did, in the portal in particular, and the excitement of portal versus high school. I would just kind of look at this, and so what this 24-25 season is going to kind of show, I think initially, it's going to show kind of the last year of the totally unregulated marketplace, pre-equilibrium marketplace, that we're going to start seeing now. The equilibrium is going to start moving, and so it's going to be more about how did you do it versus what did you do. It's going to be a question of efficacy. It's going to be a question of efficiency and effectiveness versus just who you got on your roster. I think because you're going to see more, because I think that there have been enough programs that have kind of looked at this and kind of changed their approach, that now we're going to be able to start really being able to evaluate, well, what are the impacts?
Right.
Now, Bob, do you think a lot of it depends on how Indiana's record turns out this year and what they end up doing in the tournament? Because I've seen this rhetoric the last 2 or 3 years is that Woodson's staff is very efficient at winning the offseason, especially the last couple of years in the portal. They've done a good job of that. But, I've heard multiple podcasters talk about this, and I think I heard this on the last podcast on the Brink, whenever Galen was on there as a guest, they were talking about what would be considered a successful season is making it to the Sweet 16 enough. And then now I bring that up just because, Bob, if Indiana does at least make it to the second or third week, the second weekend at least, or after that in the tournament, and they have a good solid record, does that become precedent then? Does that become normal where maybe as fans we don't focus as much on high school recruiting? Because like this year, they were able to fortunately get Sicily for next year, but then they missed on two of the other major recruits. But at the same time, as an Indiana fan, you're like, hey, I still have the portal, even though it's changing. This will be the last year of the Wild West way of looking at the portal. But I wonder if it just depends on how Indiana performs this year. Because as you said, how effective will the results be? And then that may determine what standard Indiana sets going forward.
So it's great because I'll start here is that that's previewing our next episode on how do you deal with regressions and how programs are dealing with that and using it kind of as a preview for the next season. But the results this year are going to be essential at Indiana. Just like I think I'll start with football real quick because I think going back to football that the results for Cignetti were essential because for him to have worked to maximize his effectiveness, what we've seen, and obviously what we've seen has been part of it, but he's been able to accelerate the process to the point where the culture is now almost changed. It's changed overnight. It appeared to change overnight because it did change overnight. I think for Woodson, and I'm cautious whenever we talk about tournament performance, because I think that there's a definitive distinction between North Carolina State and Marquette, for example. Like, did we put so much into the performance of one game in the tournament, whether it's oftentimes it's the NCAA tournament, even the conference tournaments. We put so much into stock into that. So I think for like Woodson right now, for Coach Woodson and for this team, I'm more interested in seedings and in final placements versus performances in the tournaments. So I'm thinking if they can jump 2 levels from being in that sort of 4th tier, top 25 percentile of college basketball, which is where you don't want to be as a Power 5 program, which is where they were in the analytics last year, and you jump into the top 5%, which is the top 20 basically, so 5 seed or better, and your top 4 in a Big Ten that's been then that's a wildly successful season because usually you can maybe go up a level, but it's really hard to jump 2, and it's really hard to jump 3, just like it's really hard to drop 3 levels. Like I think Purdue's going to see a regression, but I don't think it's going to be all the way down to 80 from 2. It's going to be maybe 25. So that maybe you drop a full level there, but I think if you're IU, it's going to be a question. I think especially we're in year 4 of the Woodson tenure. It's a twofold question. The first one is how does a number 1 type transfer roster look, and how do they play? How are the differences there? I think the style of play is going to be different, and then where do they go from here if they have a successful season? Because the question is going to be then what pieces are they going to need replacing maybe 6 or 7 roster spaces? Because then you kind of run into what Musselman ran into in Arkansas or what Calipari ran into with the one and done's model at Kentucky. The questions become much more, I guess, volatile would be the word I'd use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Questions of volatility versus questions of stability. I think ultimately fans are looking for, well, what do we have looking forward to next season?
Yeah.
Mike, where are you on that? Because I think it's a great question.
Yeah. When we talk about, this kind of harkens back to some of our prior episodes when we talk about coaching tenures. That was one of the first episodes I think we did here. And I've always looked at coaching tenures in the context almost like politicians. The whole idea of the chip stack is basically just your popularity number. Do you have 60% support amongst the voters, 70, 80, or do you have more like 30, 20, 10. That's basically the whole premise of the chip stack, is the idea that there's incremental support you gain or lose based upon your performance. And yeah, well, in the context of, let's say, like the portal and using high school versus portal kids, we just know that the fact that Indiana fans generally, compared to the most other programs fans, they're just more sentimental about their high school players. It's just true. I mean, Indiana basketball fans are very much like University of Texas football fans. Talk to UT fans about whether they want to have the local high school kid from Dallas Kimball versus some transfer kid from California. The commentary you'll get will sound very much like an IU basketball fan talking about a kid from Newcastle versus a kid from Spokane. So when you lose, but you're right, if you lose, let's say, too many high school kids, that's obviously a negative in your PR, right? Because again, it's a sentimental thing. It has nothing to do with performance. It's just, I like these kids. I want Indiana kids to play at IU. So if you lose them, obviously you take a hit in your PR, in your chip stack. But how do you win it back? Well, you win it back from actually winning games. Now, the thing is, it's probably better for your PR to win, let's say, to get an Elite Eight with Indiana kids, versus getting to Elite Eight without Indiana kids. So I think the context matters. So the question is more like, can you get to a Final Four with most transfers? And will that be about equal to having like an Elite Eight with Indiana kids? So there's a level of gradation here that's at work, that I think you have to win above, let's say, your normal level if you're using a lot of portals, just knowing like how the fans tend to think about these things. But yeah, it's I'm kind of with Bob. I think a few episodes ago I said, when I was looking at the roster, I said the capacity is about a 5 seed. And that's like where I set the midpoint. That can be like a 4 seed or a 6 seed, if it moves like one little deviation over. But yeah, it's hard to say exactly what's going to satisfy fans, because you don't know every little detail of what happens in the year. Because you could say, well, they get really far, but what if they got swept by Purdue? What if Purdue like wins at IU by 20 at Assembly Hall? Like, people are going to be really mad. Let's say you have the exact same outcome, but you sweep Purdue. You win by 30 or 20 or 30 at Mackey Arena. That's going to be a massive difference in terms of the sentiments that the fans are going to have. So again, I think it's good to sort of set these high-end, I guess, benchmarks. But in terms of like the totality, you don't really know until you actually go through the season and say, okay, did we really hit those high chip stack winning wins in the year? Or did a lot of our wins were just kind of like, okay, we beat who we're supposed to, and we lost who we were supposed to, and really it's sort of like a neutral outcome. But I think a lot of the specific wins and losses are going to play a lot in terms of how people are going to react and looking back on, hey, yeah, the portal worked and it made us have a happy season.
That's an important point to bring up, Mike, because you're right on context. It has to be considered about, I think it's something like, I could be exaggerating, but I want to say like, isn't 8 of the 10 largest high school basketball gyms in the country in Indiana? Something like that. So
I think it's
obviously
13 of the biggest 15 or something.
Yeah,
like
it's not just a movie like Hoosiers, but there's always been this kind of romanticized view of high school sports. But I wonder, Mike, if that could go under what you said on the previous segment when you brought up recalibrating, is if we look at other schools, not that I know this for sure, but if we look at the other schools over the last decade or less that are successful going to the Final Fours, if they're not using players that are native from their state, but they're still successful, does that mean as Indiana fans, we need to recalibrate the way we think and don't value as much the in-state recruit as much as getting the talent, no matter where they're from? Or I guess what I'm asking is, this might be sacrilegious to bring this up. I'm not trying to sound like anti-Indiana, because I love Indiana. I love there. But it's one of those things where, is it one of those things where we need to evolve as well? If other programs are evolving, then maybe we should also reprioritize something. And I know that's a cultural shift. That's a whole nother probably podcast discussion for something like that. But I wonder what you and Bob think of that.
Yeah, well, don't worry about, stabbing at sacred cows here. Remember, we coined the phrase barbershop here.
This is what we
yeah.
do.
Yeah, when you said that last episode, I can picture the scene.
Hey, Robbie,
perfectly.
you know what a sacred cow is? A really good tasting hamburger.
Exactly. Yeah, no. So yeah, we've sort of discussed this on our podcast where we talked about Hoosiers is not a documentary. We speak up this often about the sentimentality that Indiana fans have towards their high school kids, and that sometimes, yeah, it can be a little bit of a hurdle just because basketball evolves, it changes. And what I always say is, like, think about where you want to be as a program. Like, what win total do you want to get to? What program do you want to look like? And then look at what they do. If you want to be like Kansas, well, you have to kind of do the things that Kansas does. Or you have to find some model that is adaptable to you, that is really innovative, that's even better than what Kansas does. But you're right. I think that because it's sentimental, I mean, that's an emotional commitment. If we go back to our previous podcast about biases, that's a big bias to overcome. People, like, telling people that have been cheering for Indiana high school kids to come to IU for decades and suddenly come out and said, sorry, folks, it's, we have to go for the mercenaries now. And that's literally how they think about it. Well, these kids are mercenaries. Of course, now, if you win enough, no one is calling Curt Cignetti's recruits from JMU mercenaries. Why are they not calling them that? Well, because they're obliterating everyone they play every week and making all the fans happy. So you're right. It can be won, but, and I say won, I mean that literally. If you win enough, people won't care. Some people will care, but the winning has to be very pronounced. And that's why I say that you really have to start thinking in context of Final Fours and banners. I don't think Sweet 16s are going to make people forget high school recruits.
And I would also just look at, when you have in high school recruits, if you bring in people who fit well with your culture, it works. And I think that's a big element of it as well. That, I think that there have been some issues throughout different fan bases over the years or different programs throughout the years, where if you try to ram a round peg into a square hole, it doesn't always work well for you. That being, I do think at the end of the day, and Robbie, we really appreciate you coming on, because what's great about, and what's great about this process is the discussion with the question, kind of the Socratic seminar format was beautifully done. Right. And, love teaching in that environment, but also love learning in that environment and working through that environment as well. You've really it really kind of touches on not just our thing, let's go a level deeper on this, which is, you can, and we say this all the time, you can appreciate your past without living in it. You don't have to live in your paradigm. And the paradigm's always changing. In reality, Indiana basketball is not, looked a lot different in 1975 than it did in 1955. Clavio talks about that a lot. We've talked about that here as well. Kentucky functioned differently from 1960 to 1990, to those teams. And what it represents. What it represents is that, progress is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a necessary thing. And if you want to keep your past, you're going to have to stay relevant in the present with your eye to the future. Mm-hmm. That's the real question for us as a fan base. And I think Mike and I in particular keep pushing that a little bit, because it's like, okay, it's not going to look like it did before, but it may feel the same way to you. And it's something you can share with your kids. And that, I think, is what's really important to keep in mind, is that's the case, that it can be something that can be still precious to us if we continue to adapt in a way. Tactics and values are different things.
Yeah, and also we have to consider the next generation of fans, right? Because Galen sees that on a daily basis as a professor. He can gauge what they care about. For fans like us that grew up under that Knight era, we still have that aura, and that we know the movie Hoosiers. We still have, we value tradition. That's something that we can't deny as Indiana fans, is that, on our value hierarchy, we have tradition very high. But I wonder what students like my nephew's age at like 23, 24 and lower, like, what do they value? Does the tradition really mean as much to them? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying they may value something else. And that's where we have to figure out what the next generation of Indiana fans desire. Like, what is it that they want? So we can't just live in the past. And then those of us that are older fans, we still have to find ways of valuing the game without being stuck with like that past psychology to have to dictate all the decision making.
If Kilroy's becomes Shalubies and I have to eat a soggy sandwich, I'll eat a soggy sandwich.
Someone's going to do that at some point.
Yeah, it will. It's going to become the next Kilroy's.
It's going to happen. It will be. This will be manifested in a real environment. It will happen.
It has been memed into existence.
Yeah, it has been.
First to market.
Yeah. But hey, Bob, you're on record though. You are willing to change. You're willing to do what most Indiana fans have the stereotype of not being willing, and that is to evolve and to change. You're willing to eat a soggy sandwich for your fandom. That is honorable.
If Scotty Taylor is behind the bar at Shalubies, what used to be Kilroy's, then I will be the first in line.
Yeah,
I have to, but I also have I have standards and I have practices, and Mike knows, and that's about maybe 2 of our listeners will be able to make that reference. But my old high school friend who was a bartender in Bloomington for many years in the 90s and early 2000s, who moved to Florida. I want him back in Indiana. He's not coming back, but just I want to have.
It would be great to have Scott back. That's true. Yeah.
It would be.
Yeah. All right.
Well, on that note. Thanks again, Robbie, for coming on the show. And really the conversation over the last 3 weeks has been a hell of a lot of fun for me. And I know I'm not going to speak for Mike, but I know he's into it as well. We've enjoyed really getting to know you over the last few weeks, and hope we'll keep that conversation going as we like to do on this show frequently. And as a result, we thank Bob Thompson for the music and sound of the show. And a special thank to John Rigger of rigdesign.com for designing our logo and the look of this show. And just really appreciate getting you on the show to kind of pick your brain and letting you pick our brains a little bit.
Well, hey, I appreciate it. Like I said, I was understandably a little nervous at the onset of being on the show, even though I do this all the time. It's just really because I respect the show and I respect the network, especially too, because I know a lot of you guys that are through that. And I just didn't want to let you all down. I wanted to kind of live up to the legendary expectations of Bob and Mike. I don't want to ruin the chemistry, But for me, it's nice not to just only talk about history all the time. And I hope that I can return the favor to you guys, because over the last 3 weeks, talking to you all about history and current issues and things like that, I've been able to poach some of your all's ideas and actually utilize it in the classroom and on the podcast too. So I don't know. To me, it's great, and listening to you guys and being a part of this. It's just it reiterates the 5 years ago, whenever I'll never forget, one of my best memories was whenever we were doing the Hoosier Heartland podcast. We went up. I don't know if do you remember the Hoosier Hysterics event that they did at the Bluebird?
Yep.
Yeah.
So we were there. So I was able to be there, and I met so many good fans. I sat down and talked to Sharon Wilkerson for the first time, and Sage Steele, and all these people that I would never think about meeting before. And then I was there, and Bob Knight came in. It was like this huge shock surprise. But I thought to myself, if it wasn't for being a part of a podcast and a community with you guys in it, there's no way I would have been able to have a moment like that. That's a pretty cool thing. And so when there's seasons like what's going on right now with Indiana football and hopefully with basketball, it just helps it to be able to share that with you guys in the other community. Not to sound too cheesy, but it's cool to be able to share that along with other people, especially since I live in bluegrass country. I live in Southern Kentucky, so I'm stuck between Tennessee fans and UK fans down here. So it's always a joy and an escapism to be able to fall into the depths of Indiana fandom.
Wow. So hearing us on the Back Home Network, that must be like Radio Free Europe for
yes, very similar. It is liberating. Yes, it is. It liberates me from my daily grind here.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Well, like I said, Robbie, there will be other shows down the road, and I hope you will be open to the possibility of maybe making a return at some point, because I think this was a very, very good conversation. But yeah, so looking forward for next episode 21, the 2024-2025 basketball season. What programs are looking at bouncing back from coaching tenure regressions? What does that mean for the teams and their fans? So we'll look to drop that in about 2 weeks' time. So let's look for that probably around mid-November. Until then, this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, Right at Meridian, The Dribble Drive, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and BackHomeNetwork.com. Until next time, I'm Mike Weemuth.
I'm Bob Motes.
Take care, everybody.